Welcome back to the Film Box. If you're here, you already know what we do. We don't just watch films, we crack them open. We pull out every layer, every choice, every hidden detail, and we lay it all out together. I'm genuinely glad you're here for this one because today we're opening a box that I have complicated feelings about. And complicated feelings, those always make for the best conversations. San Andreas, a disaster film that cost nearly $250 million to make, starred one of the most watchable human beings on the planet, and somehow managed to be both deeply entertaining and quietly frustrating at the same time. That tension between spectacle and substance is exactly what we're going to dig into today. So get comfortable. Let's open this up. Here's the thing about San Andreas that most people forget to mention. This film isn't really about an earthquake. It's about a family trying to survive the version of themselves that already broke apart before a single building fell. The disaster is real. The stakes are real. The visual effects are genuinely jaw dropping in certain moments. But underneath all of that sound and fury, there's a quieter story being told. One about a father who has already failed his family once, and who gets one catastrophic, once in a lifetime chance to hold them together. That's the box, and that's why it's worth opening. Now, before we get into the story, before we talk about what happens, who lives, who doesn't, and what it all means, let's spend some time behind the lens. Because knowing how this film was made changes everything about how you see it. And this is where the film box does things differently. You deserve to understand what you're watching before we walk through it together. So let's start with the scale, because this is the first thing that puts everything in context. San Andreas reportedly had a production budget of around $210 million, and a significant portion of that went directly into visual effects. According to reports from the production team, the filmmakers worked with visual effects studios to build digital models of actual San Francisco landmarks, including the Golden Gate Bridge and the Trans-America Pyramid, in enough detail that they could realistically simulate how those structures would collapse under the kind of tectonic force the film imagines. This isn't generic disaster movie CGI. The production reportedly consulted with engineers and geologists to understand how buildings actually fail, how they buckle, how they tilt, how debris moves, so that when you watch those sequences, they carry a weight that feels grounded even in their excess. Knowing that changes how you see those destruction sequences. They're not just spectacle for its own sake, they're a production team that genuinely tried to make the impossible feel real. The second thing worth knowing is the casting of Dwayne Johnson and the specific reason his presence changes the entire emotional register of this film. Johnson was reportedly brought on not simply because of his box office pull, though that was certainly a factor, but because the filmmakers wanted a lead who could carry both the physical demands of an action film and the quieter emotional beats of a family story without one undermining the other. What's fascinating is that Johnson himself has spoken in interviews about connecting personally to the theme of a father's sense of failure and redemption. He lost his own father in complicated ways, and there are reportedly moments in the film's more vulnerable scenes where he drew on that. That personal connection doesn't show in some obvious theatrical way, but it does give certain quiet scenes a weight that you might otherwise miss. Look for it and you'll find it. Third production detail. The film's director, Brad Peyton, reportedly made a very deliberate decision about the film's color palette. He pushed for a warmer, almost golden visual tone in the early sequences before everything falls apart, specifically to create a visual contrast with the gray, ash-filled destruction sequences that follow. It's a technique borrowed from disaster cinema classics. This idea that you have to make the world feel beautiful and alive before you tear it apart, or the audience doesn't feel the loss. According to interviews with the cinematography team, that warm palette in the opening act wasn't accidental. It was designed to make you feel what's being lost, not just see it. Once you know that, watch the early scenes again. The sunlight in those frames is doing real emotional work. Fourth, the practical work. It has been noted that while the majority of the large-scale destruction sequences were created digitally, the field actually built and destroyed several practical sets for the ground level sequences, particularly the scenes set in parking structures and building interiors. This was reportedly a deliberate choice by Peyton to ensure that when actors were reacting to the world collapsing around them, some of what they were responding to was genuinely there, real debris, real shaking rigs, real disorientation. This is one of the quiet differences between a disaster film that feels lived in and one that feels like a video game cutscene. San Andreas earns its tactile moments precisely because some of them were actually built and actually destroyed. And fifth, a detail that genuinely changes how you read the film's ending. According to production notes and interviews, the original cuts of this film reportedly featured a more ambiguous conclusion, one where the emotional resolution between Ray and Emma was left less neatly tied. Test audiences, according to reportedly available marketing research, responded strongly to the desire for a clear emotional release after 2 hours of sustained tension. The decision to shift toward a more definitive emotional landing was a deliberate post production choice. Why does this matter? Because it explains why the final act feels slightly different in rhythm from everything before it. The film earns its spectacle, honestly, but its emotional resolution was reportedly shaped by what audiences needed rather than what the story strictly demanded. Keep that in mind when we get there. So, what is San Andreas? Released in May of 2015, directed by Brad Peyton and starring Dwayne Johnson alongside Carla Gugino, Alexandra Dario, Iowan Ruford, Paul Giamatti, and Hugo Johnstone Burt. This is an American disaster action film produced by New Line Cinema. At its genre core, it's a survivor film. A father racing against an apocalyptic event to find his daughter and reconnect with his estranged wife. But it's also something slightly more interesting than that label suggests. It's a film about the specific emotional logic of people who have been trained to save strangers, but who have failed to save the people closest to them. Brad Peyton, who had previously worked with Johnson on the fantasy adventure Journey to the Mysterious Island, was reportedly drawn to San Andreas because it offered a chance to make a disaster film that felt emotionally grounded rather than purely spectacle driven. The intention, according to various interviews, was always to make the personal story carry as much weight as the visual scale. Whether that intention fully succeeded is something we'll get into, but the fact that the intention was there shapes everything you're looking at. This isn't a film made carelessly. Should you watch it? Here's my spoiler free take. If you enjoy large scale disaster cinema and you're willing to extend some goodwill to a story that occasionally prioritizes feeling over logic, yes, absolutely. It's visually ambitious. It's genuinely exciting in stretches. And Dwayne Johnson is enormously watchable even when the screenplay doesn't fully serve him. If you need your disaster films to also be rigorous character studies, you may find it wanting. But it earns its entertainment honestly, and for a film of this scale, that is not a small thing. Now, let me tell you what it felt like to actually watch it. My first impression, and I mean the very first few minutes, was surprise. Because San Andreas does not open the way you expect it to. It doesn't open with a skyline or a scientist or a news broadcast about seismic activity. It opens with a rescue. A young woman trapped in a car, wedged in a ravine after a road accident. And the rescue is conducted by a helicopter unit operating with genuine precision and quiet intensity. There's no grandstanding, no dramatic speech, just a team doing an extraordinarily dangerous job with practice calm. And at the center of that team is Ray Dwayne Johnson's character, executing the rescue with a focus that tells you everything about who this man is before a single word of backstory is delivered. I walked in expecting a big dumb fun disaster movie. What I got in those first 10 minutes was something that felt more carefully constructed than the genre usually bothers to be. The rescue sequence is genuinely well directed. The spatial logic is clear. The danger feels real. And the moment it's over and Ray steps back onto solid ground, there's a beat, just a beat, where you see something shift in his face. Something that has nothing to do with the rescue he just completed and everything to do with whatever he's carrying underneath. That moment hooked me because a disaster film that opens with that kind of quietness, that kind of human specificity, that's a film that at least wants to be more than the sum of its explosions. The world the film creates in that first act is warm and recognizable. California sunlight, urban sprawl, family routines in various stages of fracture. Ray and Emma are separated. Their daughter Blake is heading off with Emma's new partner, the wealthy developer Daniel Riddick. There's a surface pleasantness to these early scenes that masks a low hum of emotional damage. The film knows what it's doing here. It's building the before so the after means something. And then, out in the Nevada desert, a man named Lawrence, a seismologist played by Paul Giamatti, is about to discover something that changes everything. The earth is about to move. Not gradually, not forgivingly all at once. And this is the moment the box opens completely. But we're not there yet. Let's walk through how we arrive at it. Ray gets a call. The quake has already begun, and it is not a warning, it is not a tremor. The Hoover Dam sequence that follows is the film's first major set piece, and it lands with a force that sets the visual standard for everything that comes after. Watch the way the dam doesn't simply crack, it unravels. The engineering logic of it, the way smaller failures cascade into catastrophic ones, gives the sequence a horrible credibility. Paul Giamatti's Lawrence watches it happen, watches years of seismic data become reality in a matter of seconds, and his face in that moment is doing something important. It's not the face of someone who didn't expect this. It's the face of someone who hoped he was wrong and now has to live with the fact that he wasn't. From here, the film splits its story across multiple threads. Ray, diverted from his original flight, turns back to reach Emma in Los Angeles. Emma, caught in a high rise when the first major earthquake strikes, is forced to rely on Ray and her own instincts to survive. Blake, stranded in San Francisco with Daniel, encounters two young British brothers, Ben and Ollie, who become her survival companions when Daniel proves himself to be something rather different from the man he presented himself as. And Lawrence at Caltech races to warn the public about what he now knows is coming. A second, far larger quake targeting San Francisco. What's interesting about this story architecture is that it's actually structured around three simultaneous tests of character. Ray is being tested against his role as a rescuer. Can he prioritize his own family the way he would prioritize strangers? Emma is being tested against her own decisions, specifically her choice of Daniel, and what that choice says about what she thought she needed after her marriage to Ray fell apart. And Blake is being tested against her upbringing. She has absorbed more of her father's emergency skills than anyone, including herself, seems to have realized. The earthquake isn't the story. The earthquake is the pressure that forces these three tests to happen simultaneously. The romance between Blake and Ben is one of the film's lighter threads, but it serves a structural purpose. It gives Blake someone to protect, which is what activates the competence and courage she inherited from her father. Hugo Johnston Burt plays Ben with an appealing combination of wit and genuine terror, and his chemistry with Alexandra Daddario is easy and unforced. These scenes work in the way that good blockbuster supporting work always works. You like these people, you want them to survive, and their survival matters because of how it affects the people around them. The film's central destruction sequence, the earthquake tearing through San Francisco, is where the production budget is most visibly and most effectively deployed. Buildings don't just fall, they fall in the specific, unpredictable way that large structures actually fail, according to the engineering consultants who reportedly worked on the visual effects sequences. Streets don't just crack, they ripple, as if the ground itself has become a liquid. And over all of it, a sound design that was reportedly crafted to simulate the actual acoustic signature of major seismic events. That low, sustained roar that witnesses of real earthquakes often describe as the thing that frightened them most, even more than the shaking itself. Blake and her companions work their way through this collapsing city with a combination of luck, preparation, and the kind of improvised problem solving that the film earns by establishing. Early on, that Blake has been raised by someone who knows how to turn a disaster into a series of smaller, solvable problems. That competence feels credible. It doesn't feel like the film simply deciding she can do things because the plot needs her to. It feels like the natural expression of who she is, given who raised her. Meanwhile, Ray reaches Emma in a sequence set in a collapsing skyscraper that is frankly terrifying in its spatial logic. And together they set out for San Francisco in a helicopter, then a truck, then a boat, navigating a landscape that is being systematically erased around them. The boat sequence, in which they ride a wave created by the earthquake through what used to be a city street, is one of those moments where the film's visual ambition and its physical absurdity arrive at exactly the same time, and you have to decide how much goodwill you're extending. I extended it because by that point the film had earned enough emotional credit that I was willing to go wherever it needed to take me, and the film takes you somewhere you genuinely do not expect. Because San Andreas is not ultimately a film about surviving an earthquake. It's about surviving the thing you've been carrying since before the earthquake started. And the truth of that, what it costs, what it means, and what it asks of the people involved, is what the film has been building toward from the very first frame. So let's slow down here, because the middle of this film is where the real craft lives, and I want to make sure we spend the time it deserves. Most people who talk about San Andreas talk about the spectacle, the collapsing buildings, the tsunami, the Golden Gate sequence. And yes, we are absolutely going to talk about all of that. But before we get to the moments everyone remembers, I want to walk you through the connective tissue, the scenes between the disasters, because that's where the film either works or it doesn't. And San Andreas is a far more interesting case study than people give it credit for. Let's go back to Ray for a moment, because there's something about how this character is written that I think most people process emotionally but never quite articulate consciously. Ray Gaines is a rescue helicopter pilot with the Los Angeles Fire Department. He is, by every professional measure, exceptional at his job. The opening rescue sequence establishes that without any doubt, he operates under pressure with the kind of calm that only comes from years of practice and genuine aptitude. He reads terrain, he anticipates risk, he keeps his team focused and functional even when the situation is deteriorating in real time. On paper, this man is exactly who you want when everything is falling apart. But here is the quiet irony at the heart of San Andreas, and this is the detail that most people miss on a first watch. The same qualities that make Ray extraordinary in a professional crisis are the exact qualities that failed him in his personal life. He is a man who knows how to function in catastrophe. What he apparently never learned was how to function in the ordinary, slow moving difficulty of grief, of loss, of a marriage under strain. The film tells you, carefully and without melodrama, that Ray and Emma lost a daughter, not Blake, an earlier daughter, Mallory, a drowning accident, and the weight of that loss cracked something between them that neither of them knew how to repair. Ray responded the way he always responds, by going to work, by throwing himself into rescues, by doing the thing he's good at instead of sitting with the thing that was destroying him quietly from the inside. Emma, on the other hand, responded by eventually making a decision. She moved forward. She found Anya. She chose, or tried to choose, a version of life that didn't feel like it was permanently underwater. And you can feel in every scene between Carla Gugino and Dwayne Johnson in this film both the history and the distance between those two choices. Gugino is doing something genuinely specific in this performance. She's not playing a woman who has stopped loving Ray. She's playing a woman who has stopped waiting for Ray to be the person she needed him to be, and who is not entirely sure that the person she chose instead is going to be who she needs him to be either. That doubt is written into her face in every scene with Iowan Gruffudd's Daniel. Watch her eyes in those early sequences. There's a wariness there, a woman who is hoping she's right and afraid she isn't. Daniel himself is an interesting choice on the part of the screenplay. He's positioned early as the antagonist, the wealthy, handsome usurper who has stepped into the space Ray vacated. But here's where it gets layered. Daniel is not written as a cartoon villain. He is written as a man who performs the idea of a good partner very convincingly, and who genuinely may have believed in that performance until the moment it cost him something real. When the earthquake hits, and Daniel is faced with a genuine choice between his own survival and the survival of Blake, and he makes the wrong choice, the film is not saying that Daniel was always secretly evil. It's saying that some people only discover who they really are in extremity. Daniel had never been in extremity before. He had always lived in the comfortable middle distance where the performance of decency is indistinguishable from the real thing. The earthquake didn't change him. It just showed him and everyone else who he already was. This is actually one of the sharper character observations in a film that gets dismissed as brainless spectacle. The earthquake as truth-telling mechanism. As a force that strips away performance and leads only essence, Ray is still a rescuer. Emma is still someone who survives by adapting. Blake is still her father's daughter in every skill and instinct that matters. And Daniel is still, underneath the penthouse and the charm, someone who will choose himself when the stakes are real. The earthquake didn't create any of this. It just made it impossible to look away from. Now, Blake. Alexandra Daddario gives the film's most physically demanding and emotionally consistent performance, and I think she's consistently underrated in discussions of this film. There's a tendency to focus on Johnson because he is, by any measure, the film's gravitational center, but Daddario is doing something more quietly impressive. She's playing a character who has to be simultaneously vulnerable and capable, frightened and functional, a daughter who needs rescuing, and a young woman who is, in many of the most important moments, doing the rescuing herself. The scene where Blake first encounters Ben and Ollie before the earthquake in a parking structure in San Francisco is a small piece of character work that pays off enormously later. She notices things. She asks the right questions. When the shaking starts, she doesn't freeze, she moves, she thinks, she instructs. And there's a moment after they've survived the initial collapse and are trying to orient themselves in the wreckage where she runs through a mental checklist of priorities: water, shelter, communication, elevated ground, and you realize that this is not improvisation. This is training. This is a woman who grew up hearing her father talk through emergency scenarios the way other families talk about weekend plans. That grounding makes every subsequent survival sequence feel earned rather than convenient. When Blake figures out how to create a signal, when she navigates the flooded streets, when she makes a decision that saves Ben's life at risk to her own, you're not watching a plot device operate. You're watching a character execute the specific skills she was raised with in the specific crisis she was raised to handle. The film trusts that setup enough to pay it off without underlining it, and that trust is one of its genuine virtues. Let me talk about the story's pacing for a moment, because it's important to understand how Brad Peyton structures the escalation. The film operates on a principle of deliberate withholding. Each major disaster sequence is preceded by a period of relative quiet in which character dynamics are developed and relationships are tested at a lower emotional temperature. The Hoover Dam sequence comes early, is spectacular, and then the film immediately pulls back. It doesn't stack disaster upon disaster, it breathes. It lets you process what you've seen and re engage with the people you're following. Then it builds again. Then it releases. Then it builds higher. This is actually a structurally sophisticated approach to disaster filmmaking, one that the less careful films in this genre consistently fail to execute. When everything is constantly at maximum intensity, the audience goes numb. The brain stops registering danger as danger and starts reading it as background noise. Peyton reportedly understood this, and the rhythm of San Andreas reflects that understanding. The escalation is real. Each sequence is measurably more intense than the one before it. And because the quieter scenes between the disasters are doing genuine emotional work, the return to danger each time lands with renewed force. The earthquake hit in Los Angeles is the film's second major set piece, and it introduces a visual idea that I find genuinely striking: the way the film renders the sound before the shaking begins. There's a moment of almost complete silence, then a low subsonic vibration that you feel before you consciously register it as sound, and then the world comes apart. Peyton reportedly worked closely with the sound design team to replicate the actual acoustic experience described by survivors of major seismic events. That specific sequence of near silence, then subsonic frequency, then catastrophic noise. It's a small thing, but it makes every earthquake sequence feel like something that could actually happen to you. And that feeling is the difference between a disaster film you watch and a disaster film you experience. Emma's sequence in the Los Angeles high rise is where Carla Gugino gets to demonstrate why she was the right choice for this role. She's not simply waiting to be rescued. She's actively solving the problem of her own survival, reading the building's structural failures, making decisions about which directions to move, using her environment with an intelligence that mirrors Ray's professional instincts. When Ray arrives in the helicopter, threading through a cityscape that is collapsing around him with an almost surgical focus, the reunion doesn't feel like a rescue. It feels like two people who know how to function in extremity finally functioning in extremity together. And for a moment, in the middle of the worst disaster in American history, something between them settles. It's a brief moment. The film doesn't linger on it, which is the right instinct. Because settling isn't the same as resolved, and the real resolution, the emotional resolution that the film has been building toward from its first frame, is still an hour away and requires a great deal more destruction to arrive at. Now, the San Francisco sequences. This is where the film opens up its full visual language, and it is genuinely extraordinary to look at. The destruction of Fisherman's Wharf, the collapse of the Bay Bridge, the way the Trans-America Pyramid sways and lists, these are images with a genuine visual poetry to them, even in their catastrophic content. The production team reportedly worked with structural engineers to ensure that the failure modes depicted were physically plausible for each specific type of building and infrastructure. And you can feel that consultation in the specificity of what you're seeing. Buildings don't fall in generic ways. They fall in the ways that those specific kinds of buildings, under those specific kinds of stress, actually fail. Blake, Ben, and Ollie are navigating this environment on foot, which is both the film's greatest source of tension and its most effective scale device. Everything you see in the wide shots, the panoramic devastation, the collapsing skyline, is subsequently experienced at ground level through the eyes of three people with no equipment, no preparation, and no way of knowing what's coming next. It's a classic disaster film technique, the zoom between the macro and the micro, but San Andreas executes it with more spatial coherence than most. You always know where these three people are in relation to the distraction around them. The geography of the film is consistently legible, which is harder to achieve than it sounds when you are simultaneously depicting the geographic collapse of a major American city. The moment Blake makes contact with Rating, communicating her location, her situation, her status, is one of those scenes that works entirely on performance. There's no major visual effect in this moment. It's two actors, a phone connection, and the specific weight of a father hearing his daughter's voice when he wasn't sure he was going to hear it again. Johnson plays this with a restraint that is more powerful than any amount of theatrical breakdown would be. He doesn't collapse. He doesn't shout. He goes very still. And in that stillness, you see everything: the relief, the fear, the resolve, and underneath all of it, the guilt. The specific guilt of a man who knows that his daughter is in that city partly because of choices he made or didn't make long before the earth started moving. That guilt is Ray's real antagonist in this film, not the earthquake. The earthquake is just the stage. The real battle is internal, and it's a battle between the version of Ray who is a perfect professional and the version of Ray who is a deeply imperfect father. Those two versions of the same man have been at war since before the film began, and the earthquake forces that war to a resolution, not through a conversation, not through a speech, through action, through the specific, costly, irreversible act of choosing his daughter over everything else, including, in certain moments, the instinct to save everyone around him that has defined his professional identity for his entire adult life. Let me take you into the tsunami sequence because this is the film's most ambitious single set piece and it deserves careful attention. After the main quake, Lawrence and his team determined that the seismic displacement of the ocean floor is going to generate a massive wave and that it is going to make landfall in San Francisco within minutes. Blake and her companions are warned, Ray and Emma are en route by boat, and the film engineers a sequence in which all of these threats converge simultaneously in a single body of water. The visual language of this sequence is remarkable in its specificity. The wave is not a clean wall of water, the way tsunamis are typically depicted in less careful disaster films. It's a churning, debris-filled mass of everything the ocean has already consumed on its way in cars, infrastructure, sections of buildings, entire road surfaces. It moves with a weight and a momentum that feels geological rather than meteorological. And the sound design, that low, constant building roar that precedes it, gives you about 15 seconds of pure dread before it arrives. Ray's decision in this sequence to turn the boat into the wave rather than away from it is the kind of choice that only makes sense if you understand fluid dynamics and the structural physics of how a boat responds to a wave of that scale. The film trusts that you'll follow the logic without over explaining it, which is the right call. And the image of the boat cresting that wave, a small human vessel riding the most destructive force in the frame, is genuinely iconic. It's the image the marketing leaned on for good reason. It earns its place. But here's what most people miss about that sequence. In the middle of it, in the few seconds of suspension at the crest of the wave, before the descent, there's a cut to Emma's face. And Carla Gugino does something in about 2 seconds of screen time that I think is the film's single most precise piece of acting. She doesn't look terrified. She looks for just a moment, like someone who has made her peace. Not with time, with the fact that whatever comes next, she's facing it with Ray. After everything. After the grief and the distance and the failed attempt to move forward with someone else. She is here on this boat with this man, in this moment, and in Gugino's face in those 2 seconds, you can see that being enough. It's a tiny, extraordinary thing, and it's the kind of detail that disappears completely if you're watching this film on your phone. Now let's talk about what the film does brilliantly, because there are genuine areas of excellence here that deserve to be named specifically rather than lumped into general praise. Dwayne Johnson has never been a performer who gets sufficient credit for his range, and San Andreas is a useful case study in why that critical undervaluation persists and why it's wrong. Johnson's physical presence is so dominant, so immediately and overpoweringly there, that it becomes easy to overlook what he's doing emotionally in the quieter register. But watch the scenes where Ray is talking about Mallory. Watch the way he carries that name. There's a scene, and we'll come back to this in the spoiler section, where the weight of that loss becomes the fiend's actual emotional climax, and Johnson handles it with a delicacy that you might not expect from a man who also, in this same film, outswims a tsunami. The range required to be credible in both of those modes is genuinely considerable. He is credible in both. That is not a small achievement. Carla Gugino, as I've already noted, is the film's most underappreciated element. Emma could easily have been written as a reactive character, the person who needs saving, the love interest who waits at the center of the story while the men do the action. Gugino refuses that framing at every turn. Emma is consistently active, consistently intelligent, consistently the person who identifies the solution to the problem immediately in front of her, while Ray handles the larger situation. Their dynamic is a genuine partnership. Two people with complementary skills operating in concert, and that partnership gives the film an emotional texture that lifts it above its genre baseline. Alexandra Dario, as discussed, brings a specific intelligence to Blake that makes every survival sequence feel earned, but I want to highlight one particular scene that proves it. After the initial collapse in San Francisco, Blake is trapped with a rapidly flooding vehicle. She is running out of air. She is alone. Ben and Ollie are trying to get to her from outside but cannot reach her in time. And in this sequence, which lasts about 4 minutes of screen time, Daddario carries the entire emotional weight without any dialogue to lean on. She uses her breathing, her eyes, the specific way she holds her body when she decides to stop fighting the fear and start solving the problem. It's a master class in physical acting inside a very small space, and it's a scene that most clearly demonstrates why she was the right choice for this role. The direction is, in technical terms, exceptional. Brad Payton manages something that is genuinely difficult in disaster cinema. He maintains spatial coherence. At every point in every destruction sequence, you know where the characters are, what the threat is, and which direction they need to move. This sounds like basic filmmaking. It is not. Watch almost any other large scale disaster film and notice how quickly you lose your spatial bearings, how the action becomes a series of disconnected, impressive images rather than a coherent geography of danger. Peyton doesn't lose you. The camera always knows where north is. And that consistent spatial logic is what allows the tension to build properly, because you can see the gap between where the characters are and where they need to be, and you can feel that gap closing or widening in real time. The visual effects work, as already noted, is production here exceptional. But I want to specifically highlight the Golden Gate Bridge sequence because it's doing something more interesting than simple spectacle. The bridge doesn't collapse all at once. It fails progressively. First a section, then another, then the cables, then the towers. And the film maps those progressive failures against the survival situation of specific characters in real time. Each structural failure creates a new problem, a new barrier, a new decision point. The bridge is essentially functioning as a ticking clock made of steel and cable, and it's used with a precision that demonstrates exactly why the production invested in engineering consultation. When you understand how that kind of structure actually fails, you can choreograph the failure against the character's movements in a way that creates genuine, specific, non generic tension. The score, composed by Andrew Lockington, is one of those elements that works hardest when you notice it least. In the big sequences, the tsunami, the Los Angeles quake, the San Francisco destruction, the music expands to the scale of the images, driving forward with a momentum that amplifies rather than competes with the sound design. But the score's most important work is in the quieter scenes, particularly the scenes between Ray and Emma and between Ray and Blake, where it functions almost as a memory. There are thematic elements that recur across the film, a particular melodic motif associated with the lost daughter Mallory that appear briefly quietly in the underscore of certain scenes. Most viewers won't consciously register them, but they'll feel them, and that feeling is what gives those scenes an emotional resonance that goes beyond what the dialogue alone is delivering. The one scene I consider completely unforgettable, and I want to be precise about why, is the phone call between Ray and Blake after she makes contact from San Francisco. I've already described the mechanics of it, but the reason it's unforgettable isn't the mechanics, it's the subtext. When Ray hears Blake's voice, the first thing he says, before any practical question about her location or her safety, is her name. Just her name. Twice. And in the way Johnson says it, you hear everything the film has been building underneath the spectacle. The grief for Mallory, the fear of losing another daughter, the specific, devastating vulnerability of a man who is professionally fearless, discovering that the one thing that can genuinely break him is the sound of his child's voice from a place where he cannot immediately reach her. That moment is the film. Everything else is the delivery mechanism for that moment. And now, let's be honest about where San Andreas falls short. Because it does fall short, in specific ways, and those shortcomings matter. The most significant problem is the screenplay's treatment of Daniel Riddick. Iwan Grufad is a genuinely capable actor. He brings a surface charm to the role that works in the early scenes, and his pivot in the earthquake is appropriately chilling. But the film makes a structural error by abandoning him after that pivot. Once Daniel reveals himself as someone who will save himself at the expense of a child, he essentially disappears from the film's moral attention. He reappears briefly later, in a sequence involving a shipping container and a collapsing structure, but the film handles that moment with a casual ruthlessness that undercuts the complexity it had spent time building. If you are going to write a character as a vehicle for a meaningful idea about performance versus character, then that character deserves a resolution that engages with the idea. San Andreas doesn't give him one. It disposes of him efficiently and moves on, and that efficiency feels like a missed opportunity. The second problem is pacing in the second act. Between the Los Angeles earthquake and the San Francisco tsunami, the film has a stretch of about 20 minutes in which the various narrative threads, Ray and Emma's journey, Blake's ground level survival, Lawrence's attempts to warn the public, are being advanced simultaneously. In theory, this cross cutting should maintain tension across the whole. In practice, some of the Lawrence sequences slow the film's forward momentum to a degree that is difficult to fully recover from. Paul Giamatti is doing everything right. His Lawrence is earnest, frightened, and driven by a genuine sense of moral responsibility. But the scenes in which he attempts to broadcast warnings and navigate institutional resistance don't carry the same stakes as the sequences they're intercutting with. The film needed to either make these scenes more personally costly or stream them. It does neither. And you feel the drag. Third, and this is perhaps the film's most significant thematic shortcoming, the depiction of background civilian casualties is handled with a strange inconsistency. The film's visual effects team has clearly put enormous work into depicting the scale of destruction in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and that scale implies a loss of life that is genuinely staggering. But the film almost entirely refuses to engage with that loss at the human level. We see buildings fall, we see water consume streets. We see at various points evidence of massive human tragedy in the background of our protagonist's survival story. But the film never pauses, not once, not for a single meaningful scene, to acknowledge the weight of what is being destroyed around the people it has decided to follow. This is a choice, not an oversight, and it's a choice that has consequences. Because in the real world, in the actual experience of catastrophic disaster, survivors are defined as much by what they witness happening to strangers as by their own survival. The disconnection between the visual scale of what San Andreas depicts and the emotional register in which it depicts it creates an uncomfortable gap. You are watching a film in which hundreds of thousands of people are by implication dying, and the film is asking you to experience that primarily as a backdrop for one family's reunion. There's something slightly troubling about that math, and the film never acknowledges it. I want to be clear that this is a criticism of the film as a piece of storytelling, not of the filmmakers as people. The choice to focus tightly on the Gaines family is narratively coherent. It's what gives the film its emotional engine. But the visual scale of the destruction creates a moral debt that the tight focus doesn't fully repay. A single scene, even 30 seconds of Ray or Emma pausing to register the enormity of what they're moving through, would have changed this calculus significantly. The absence of that scene is the most honest criticism I can make of San Andreas as a film. Fourth, and this is a smaller point but it compounds the others, the film's dialogue in the midsection occasionally substitutes explanation for emotion. There are scenes where characters articulate things to each other about their relationship, about their feelings, about the situation that would have been more powerfully expressed through action or implication. The screenplay is at its best when it trusts the actors to carry the subtext without the text spelling it out. It doesn't always trust them, and in the moments when it doesn't, you feel the machinery of the plot moving underneath the surface in a way that reminds you that you're watching a constructed thing rather than experiencing a real one. None of these flaws is fatal. San Andreas remains an enormously watchable, visually ambitious, emotionally genuine piece of disaster cinema. But they are real, and acknowledging them is part of what makes the film's genuine achievements, which are also real, mean something. A film you love only because you ignored its problems isn't really a film you love. It's a film you've decided to protect. San Andreas doesn't need that kind of protection. It's good enough to hold up under honest scrutiny, and honest scrutiny is what it deserves. What I want you to hold on to as we move forward into the film's deeper layers is this. San Andreas is a film about the specific and irreversible way that grief changes the shape of a family. The earthquake is the most spectacular possible metaphor for that process. Sudden, catastrophic, reshaping the landscape permanently. But what the earthquake is a metaphor for is something much quieter and much older: the loss of Mallory, the slow erosion of a marriage, the specific emotional distance that opens up between people who love each other but cannot find their way back to each other across the wreckage of a shared loss. The earthquake doesn't cause this damage. The earthquake just makes it visible. And that's the real story of San Andreas, not the disaster that tears the world apart, but the question of whether the people in that world can find their way back to each other when the shaking stops. And that question and its answer is what we're going to dig all the way into when we get to the full spoiler breakdown. But first, let's talk about the world this film arrived into. The moment in culture and cinema that shaped how it was received, what it was competing against, and why its legacy turned out to be more complicated than a $200 million opening weekend might suggest. So let's step back from the film itself for a moment. Because to truly understand San Andreas, you need to understand the exact cultural moment it landed in. The summer of 2015 was a fascinating and somewhat turbulent time for Hollywood blockbusters. Marvel's Avengers Age of Ultron had opened just 3 weeks earlier and was already reshaping audience expectations around what a large scale action film was supposed to deliver. Not just spectacle, but interconnected mythology, character legacy, and the kind of narrative density that rewards repeat viewing. Mad Max Fury Road had arrived the same weekend as San Andreas and had immediately become a critical phenomenon, a film that managed to be simultaneously a pure adrenaline delivery mechanism and a piece of genuine feminist filmmaking that people were going to be writing about for decades. Jurassic World was 2 weeks away and would go on to break opening weekend records. San Andreas opened into this environment and did something that surprised a lot of people. It performed, really performed. Opening weekend in North America came in around $54 million, dash. Strong for an original disaster film that wasn't a sequel or a franchise entry. Worldwide, it ultimately crossed $473 million against that production budget of approximately $210 million, making it a clear financial success by any reasonable industry measure. But the critical reception told a more complicated story. The film landed at a 50% approval rating on review aggregation sites, a number that represents something genuinely interesting, which is a film that revoked almost perfectly divided critical opinion. Roughly half the professional critics who saw it responded to its emotional sincerity and visual ambition. The other half found it formulaic, emotionally manipulative, and morally troubling in its relationship to the scale of destruction it was depicting. That divide is worth sitting with, because it's not simply a case of critics being out of touch with popular entertainment. The critics who found San Andreas troubling were engaging with the real tension in the film, the same tension I described at the end of the last section, the gap between the visual scale of the disaster and the emotional register in which the film processes it. For audiences, that gap was apparently either invisible or forgivable. The film's emotional through line was compelling enough, and its spectacle impressive enough, that the experience held together as a satisfying whole. For the critics who struggled with it, that gap felt like a moral problem. A film that was using the imagery of mass death as decoration for a domestic drama without ever truly reckoning with what that imagery implies. Both of those responses are legitimate, and the fact that the film provoked them simultaneously is, in a strange way, evidence of its ambition. A film that was purely and cynically spectacle, that had no emotional pretension whatsoever, wouldn't have generated that particular tension. You can't be disappointed by something that never tried. San Andreas tried. It just didn't always succeed in reconciling what it was trying to be. What's genuinely interesting about the cultural context, though, is the real world resonance. The San Andreas Fault is not a hypothetical threat. It is one of the most comprehensively studied geological features on the planet, and the scientific consensus in 2015 and now is that a major rupture along the southern section of the fault is not a question of if, but when. California emergency management authorities had for years prior to the film's release been running public awareness campaigns about earthquake preparedness. And San Andreas, reportedly according to various interviews with California emergency officials at the time, actually generated a measurable spike in earthquake preparedness kit purchases and emergency plan registrations in the weeks following its release. That's a strange and somewhat wonderful thing for a blockbuster to do. It is, in a modest way, evidence that spectacle and public education are not mutually exclusive. The film scared enough people in the right way that they went home and looked up what to do if it actually happened. Paul Giamatti's Lawrence, a seismologist who spends the film trying desperately to warn people what is coming and how to survive it, is in some sense the film's most important character precisely because he is the one character whose concern is everyone, not just the people he loves. And reportedly, some of the public safety messaging that Lawrence delivers in the film was developed in consultation with actual seismologists who wanted to ensure that the information being communicated was grounded enough to be useful if viewers took it seriously. Think about that for a moment. A $200 million disaster spectacle functioning, in part, as public safety communication. It's not the primary thing San Andreas is, but it's one of the things it is. And that's more than most films of its type can claim. In terms of awards recognition, San Andreas did not receive significant attention during the 2015 award cycle. The film was nominated for a Saturn Award for Best Science Fiction Film, which tells you something about how the awards community categorized it, and the visual effects work received some industry recognition, though it did not ultimately win the major prizes that films like The Martian and Star Wars The Force Awakens were competing for in the same cycle. The relative awards invisibility of San Andreas is, honestly, not surprising. The film does not fit the profile of award season cinema. It's not intimate, it's not literary. It's not the kind of work that tends to generate the kind of critical enthusiasm that drives awards campaigns. But I do think the visual effects work deserved more recognition than it received. The quality and specificity of what was achieved in those destruction sequences was genuinely pushing the boundaries of what was technically possible at the time, and that work was somewhat lost in the larger conversation dominated by the effects driven franchise films that were competing for the same attention. The film's streaming life has been interesting. San Andreas has remained in consistent rotation on various platforms in the years since its theatrical run, and it has reportedly found substantial second wave audiences, particularly in international markets where it was initially underseen. The film's action sequences and emotional clarity translate extremely well across cultural contexts, which is part of why its worldwide growth significantly outperformed its domestic numbers. There's something about the fundamental human story at its core. A parent fighting through the end of the world to reach their child, that doesn't require cultural translation. It's a story that works in any language, any context, any cultural frame. Does San Andreas feel timeless or perfectly of its era? This is a question I find genuinely difficult to answer cleanly because I think it's both. The visual effects are of a specific technological moment. They look remarkable for 2015 and they hold up reasonably well even now. But there are sequences where the digital compositing reflects the limitations of that particular moment in visual effects technology in ways that will become increasingly visible as time passes. In that sense, the film is dated and will become more dated. But the emotional architecture, the story of a family fractured by grief and tested by catastrophe, is not dated at all. It's a story structure as old as storytelling itself, and it will remain resonant as long as people have families and families have losses. So, San Andreas is, in a strange way, both a time capsule and a timeless story. The container is of its era, the contents are not. Now, let's go deeper. Let's go beneath the surface of the spectacle and ask the question that the film box always asks: what is this film really about? Not the plot, not the spectacle, not even the characters exactly. What is the film trying to say about being human? And here's what I keep coming back to every time I think about San Andreas. This film is fundamentally about the difference between two kinds of strength. There's the kind of strength that Lay has in abundance: physical capability, professional excellence, the ability to function under extreme external pressure without falling apart. That kind of strength is visible, measurable, and socially celebrated. It's the kind of strength that gets you on the news when you pull someone out of a burning building. It gets you commendations. It gets your reputation as someone the world can rely on. And then there's the other kind of strength, the kind that is required to sit with grief, to stay present with someone who is suffering in a way you cannot fix, to acknowledge that you failed the people closest to you, not to any dramatic external failure, but to the slow accumulation of absence, to choosing the manageable emergency over the unmanageable loss. That kind of strength is invisible, unmeasurable, and socially almost completely unrecognized. There's no commendation for being emotionally present through grief. There's no news story about the parent who stayed. It doesn't look like anything from the outside, and it is, in many ways, the hardest thing any person ever has to do. Ray has the first kind of strength in almost limitless supply. He has the second kind in almost no supply whatsoever. And the film argues quietly but persistently that without the second kind, the first kind is ultimately a form of running away. Ray is not a bad man. He is not an unloving father or an uncaring husband. He is a man who responded to unbearable pain by becoming extraordinarily good at something that kept him too busy to feel it. And that choice, made not maliciously, but almost certainly not even consciously, cost him everything that mattered most. The earthquake is the universe forcing Ray to stop running, to sit with the specific, devastating fear of losing another daughter, to face the reality that his professional excellence cannot protect the people he loves, that sometimes all the skill in the world and all the courage in the world is not enough, and what is left when skill and courage run out is not professionalism, it's love. It's the willingness to keep going when there is no reasonable hope of succeeding. It's the specific irrationality of a parent who refuses to accept that their child is gone. That irrationality, that refusal, is a second kind of strength. And the film is arguing that it is the more important kind. This connects to something that I think is genuinely universal in the experience of watching San Andreas, even for viewers who might not consciously articulate it. Most of us have experienced the feeling of being good at something, professionally, practically, functionally, while simultaneously failing the people closest to us in ways that are harder to see and harder to fix. Most of us have used competence as a way of avoiding vulnerability. Most of us have known someone or been someone who could handle a crisis with perfect efficiency and couldn't handle a conversation about pain with any efficiency at all. Reagan's is an extreme version of that pattern, but he's recognizable. And that recognition is what gives the film its emotional pull even for viewers who are watching it purely for the spectacle. There's also a quieter theme running underneath the main story, and it's about the nature of rescue. The film is full of rescues, literal physical rescues, executed with skill and equipment and helicopter rotors. But what the film is really tracking is an emotional rescue. The question of whether Ray can rescue his relationship with Emma, whether Emma can rescue herself from the choices she made in the aftermath of grief, whether Blake can rescue the version of her family that existed before Mallory died. The earthquake doesn't create the possibility of these rescues, it creates the necessity of them. It strips away the distance and the politeness and the careful management of a family that has been quietly disintegrating. And it forces everyone to choose, in real time, what they actually want to fight for. And what they fight for is each other. Not the version of each other that existed before. Not the pretense that the grief didn't happen or that the distance didn't form. They fight for the actual people, damaged, complicated, changed by loss that they have become. That's the rescue. That's what the film is really about. And it's a more honest thing than the spectacle surrounding it might suggest. Now, take a breath, because we are about to go into full spoiler territory. If you haven't seen San Andreas yet and you actually want to experience it fresh, which I genuinely recommend, because this is a film that works better if you don't know where it's going, close this out now. Go watch it. It's on streaming. It'll take 2 hours. Come back when you're done, and everything from this point forward will land completely differently. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now. Go watch it and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. Good. Let's get into it. The emotional climax of San Andreas is not the tsunami. It's not the destruction of San Francisco. It's not even the moment Ray and Emma pull Blake from the flooding shipping container. The emotional climax of this film is a single moment that takes place in what appears to be the aftermath of survival, and it involves a name that the film has been carrying like a held breath since the opening act: Mallory. Here's the full architecture of what the film has been doing with that name. Mallory was Ray and Emma's younger daughter. She drowned in a river accident when she was a child, an accident that Ray was present for, and that Ray has been, on some level, blaming himself for ever since. The film tells you this in fragments: a mention here, a look there, the way Ray flinches very slightly whenever his family history comes up. It's not spelled out in a single expository scene. It's distributed across the whole film in small, precise doses, the way real grief distributes itself across a life. Present in unexpected moments, absent when you're braced for it, surfacing when you're least prepared. What the film doesn't tell you until the final act, in a conversation between Ray and Blake that takes place while they're waiting out the aftershocks in a wrecked building, is the specific detail that has been haunting Ray most. He was there when Mallory died. He was a trained rescuer. He was physically present and professionally capable. And he couldn't save her. And he has never, not for a single day since, been able to fully forgive himself for that. Every rescue he has performed since Mallory's death has been on some level an attempt to balance a ledger that cannot be balanced. A way of proving to himself more than anyone that his failure to save his own daughter was an anomaly, that he is fundamentally someone who saves people, that Mallory's death was the exception, not the definition, but it is the definition. In Ray's own internal architecture, it is the defining fact of his life. And until he faces that, until he says it out loud, to Blake in words rather than helicopter rescues and professional citations, he cannot be truly present with the people who are still alive and who still need him. Not as a rescuer, as a father. The scene where this comes out is the film's quiet masterpiece. Johnson plays it with an absolute minimum of performance, which is exactly right, because this is a man who has been containing this for years and who is finally in the wreckage of the world, letting go of the container. There are no dramatic tears, no theatrical breakdown, just a man saying the thing he has never been able to say: that he failed his daughter, that he has been running from that failure ever since, and that he is terrified of failing again. And Blake, Alexandra Daddario, absolutely present in this scene, doesn't offer him absolution. She doesn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She does something more honest and more useful. She tells him that she needs him to stay, not to be perfect, not to be the rescuer, just to stay. That exchange, that specific emotional transaction, is a real resolution of San Andreas. Everything that comes after it in the plot is the film completing its spectacle obligations. The emotional story has already resolved. Ray has stopped running. Blake has given him something to stay for that isn't a rescue. And Emma, who arrives at the end of that scene having survived her own ordeal, steps into a family that is fractured and grieving and not pretending otherwise, and chooses to be part of it anyway. Not the family they were before Mallory, the family they are now. The final rescue, Blake trapped in the flooding shipping container, is the plot's version of that emotional resolution. Is the film making literal what has already happened metaphorically? Ray diving into dark, flooded water to reach his daughter is a direct echo of his failure to reach Mallory. He failed in the water once, he does not fail this time. And when he brings Blake to the surface, when she breathes, when her eyes open, when she's back, the release in Johnson's performance is not the relief of a professional completing a rescue. It is the relief of a man who has been holding his breath since Mallory died and who has finally, after everything, been allowed to exhale. The CPR sequence deserves specific attention because it is the most emotionally naked moment in the entire film, and it is handled with extraordinary care. Blake is not breathing when Ray pulls her out, And for a sustained, agonizing stretch of screen time, long enough that the doubt is real, she doesn't respond. The film does not cut away from this. It does not soften it with hopeful music or reassuring reaction shots. It holds on Ray, on his hands, on Blake's face, on the specific horrible stillness of a body that isn't breathing. And in that stillness, the film is making you feel exactly what Ray is feeling: the proximity of losing her, the specific terror of being here, this time able to do everything right, and still potentially arriving too late. And then she breathes, and then she breathes. And the film lets you have that, but it earns it by not letting you have it easily. The Golden Gate Bridge sequence, in which Blake, Ben, and Ollie attempt to cross the bridge on foot as it begins to fail, is one of the film's most effectively engineered set pieces precisely because it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. At the surface level, it's a spectacular action sequence, the progressive collapse of one of the world's most recognizable pieces of infrastructure, depicted with a structural specificity that makes it feel genuinely plausible. At a character level, it's a sequence that most clearly demonstrates Blake's inherited competence, the moment where everything her father taught her, consciously or not, comes together in a series of decisions that save three lives. And at a thematic level, it's a bridge, literally, between the world before the earthquake and the world after it. The bridge that Blake crosses is not the same bridge she came in on. The city she enters on the other side is not the city she left, and she is not the same person who started this journey. The moment Daniel abandons Blake is handled with a precision that I find genuinely impressive. He doesn't abandon her dramatically. He doesn't make a speech or reveal a hidden cruelty. He simply, in the confusion of the initial quake, with everyone scrambling and the building coming apart around them, chooses the exit that is available to him without waiting to ensure Blake is behind him. It's a moment of cowardice so small, so quick, so almost understandable that you almost miss it. And that's the point. The film isn't saying Daniel is a monster. It's saying that Daniel is a man who, when the moment came, chose himself, and that the choice was made not with malice, but with the simple, uncomplicated instinct of self preservation in a man who has never had to examine that instinct before. He didn't know he would do it until he did it, and Emma, watching it happen, knows everything she needs to know. Daniel's end, crushed by a collapsing shipping crane in the flooding San Francisco waterfront, is the film's least thoughtful narrative choice. It dispatches him efficiently, removes him from the moral equation, and allows the film to close its emotional circle without the complication of a living antagonist who wasn't really an antagonist. The problem is that it's too clean, too convenient. Daniel deserved a harder reckoning, one that engaged with the idea the film had spent time building. The fact that the earthquake kills him before anyone has to actually deal with what he did is a narrative shortcut, and it weakens the film's thematic coherence at the exact moment that thematic coherence matters most. The foreshadowing in San Andreas is, when you go back to look for it, more consistent and more deliberate than a first viewing suggests. The opening rescue sequence, a woman trapped in a vehicle that has fallen into a canyon, directly prefigures the sequence in which Blake is trapped in a flooded vehicle in San Francisco. The water that fills the car, the darkness, the limited air, the person on the outside unable to reach her in time, all of it rhymes with the opening. The difference is that in the opening, the rescue is clean, successful, professional. In the Blake sequence, it's desperate, terrifying, and personal in a way that no professional training can fully prepare you for. That deliberate echo is a sign of a screenplay that was thinking more carefully than its reputation suggests. There is also a recurring motif of things that cannot hold: bridges, buildings, marriages, families, the earth itself, that runs through the entire film as a kind of visual and structural grammar. The first thing you see in the opening credits is a fault line, not a city, not a family, a fort, a place where pressure has been building for so long that the surface above it looks stable, but isn't. That image is the film's thesis. All of the stability you see in the opening act, Ray's professional competence, Emma's new relationship, Blake's confident independence is surface stability above fault lines that have been building pressure for years. The earthquake doesn't cause the fractures, it just makes them visible. And the film's most honest visual rhyme is between the geological fault that runs beneath California and the emotional fault that runs beneath the Gaines family. Both have been there for years. Both were always going to rupture. The only question was when. Lawrence's role in the film deserves more credit than he typically receives in discussions of San Andreas, and I want to spend a moment on it here. Giamatti's character is not the protagonist. He never shares a scene with Ray or Emma or Blake, and his storyline runs entirely in parallel to theirs, but he is the film's moral compass. He is the person who, when the seismic data confirms what he feared, doesn't spend any time processing his own feelings about it. He immediately starts trying to warn people. He goes on television. He calls in emergency contacts. He argues with administrators. He pushes against every form of institutional inertia that is trying to manage the news rather than communicate it. And he does this not because he is personally brave. Giamatti plays Lawrence as genuinely frightened throughout, but because he understands that the information he has belongs to the people who need it, not to the institutions that are afraid of how they'll respond to it. There's a quiet heroism in Lawrence that the film doesn't frame as heroism at all. It just shows it and trusts you to recognize it. He doesn't get a triumphant moment. He doesn't save anyone directly. He just keeps talking into the camera, keeps pushing the information out, keeps doing the unglamorous, undramatic work of telling the truth about a dangerous situation to people who need to hear it. And in the real world, in the actual landscape of disaster management and public safety communication, that kind of heroism is far more common and far more important than the helicopter pilot kind. The film is smart enough to include it. It's just not quite smart enough to give it the weight it deserves. The ending of San Andreas, the final flames after Blake breathes, after the family holds each other in the wreckage, closes on an image that I think is doing something genuinely complex. The camera pulls back from the family to reveal the extent of the destruction around them, the flooded streets, the collapsed skyline, the changed geography of a city that no longer looks like itself. And then from within that devastation, there's a moment of what the film clearly intends as hope, an American flag unfurling in the breeze above the ruins, and Ray's voice saying something about rebuilding, about starting over, about what comes next. I have mixed feelings about that ending. On one level, it's earned. The film has been building toward the idea of rebuilding since its first frame, and the personal rebuilding of the Gaines family is genuinely and emotionally completed in the moments just before. The family is together. They have faced the worst thing and held each other through it. Ray has said the unsayable. Blake has survived the unsayable. Emma has made a choice. The real choice, not the polite management of a life, about who she wants beside her. That's a real ending. That's a complete emotional arc. But the flag and the broader note of national resilience sits slightly uneasily against the film's consistent refusal to engage with the scale of the civilian suffering around the protagonists. You can't spend 2 hours not looking at the losses of strangers and then close on a symbol of collective recovery without that closing note feeling slightly unknown. The film is trying to have it both ways. Intimate enough to be emotionally satisfying, broad enough to feel like a statement, and it doesn't quite achieve both simultaneously. That said, and I want to be clear about this, the emotional truth of the ending is real. The specific resolution between Ray and his family is earned. The final image of them together, in the wreckage, choosing each other, is genuinely moving. If the film had simply closed on them, on their faces, on the quiet fact of their survival and their togetherness, it would have been a stronger ending. The flag is the film losing its nerve slightly at the last moment, reaching for a grander meaning than the intimate story it's actually told. But the intimate story it's told is good, and that's worth holding on to. There is no post-credits scene in San Andreas. The film ends where it ends, in the ruins of San Francisco, with a family that has been broken and is now perhaps beginning to find its way to something that might eventually resemble whole. It doesn't promise wholeness, it just suggests the possibility of it. And in a film that has spent 2 hours depicting the most comprehensive destruction imaginable, the suggestion of possibility is the most honest note it could close on. My personal reaction to the ending, the first time I watched it, was complicated in the way that my rating of 6.8 reflects. I was moved, genuinely moved, by the Ray and Blake resolution, by this specific emotional transaction in that scene that I described earlier, by Johnson's performance in the CPR sequence and its aftermath, by the quiet, honest way the film handles the moment when the family simply holds each other and doesn't say anything because there is nothing adequate to say. Those moments are real, they land, they stay with you. And then the flag appeared, and I felt the film step back from itself slightly, reach for something easier than the difficult thing it had just done so well. That reaching, that slight retreat from the harder, truer note it had earned, is why the film sits at 6.8 for me, rather than somewhere higher. It comes so close to being genuinely great in its final act. The components are all there. The performances are there. The emotional architecture is there. The thematic payoff is there. And then it softens the landing slightly in a way that feels like a decision made about what the audience needed rather than what the story demanded. But here's the thing I keep coming back to: 6.8 is not a dismissal. 6.8 is a film I respect, that I found genuinely moving in stretches, that I think deserves more credit than it routinely receives, and that falls short of its potential in specific, articulable ways. That's a more interesting verdict than either outright enthusiasm or outright dismissal, and it's the honest one. So now we've been inside every layer of this box. We've walked through the production, the story, the performances, the themes, the spoilers, the emotional architecture. We've been honest about what works and what doesn't. And now it's time to close the lid, but not before we talk about the verdict in full. Because a rating without reasoning is just a number, and you deserve the reasoning. 6.8 out of 10. That's where San Andreas lands for me. And I want to spend some real time unpacking what that number actually means. Because I think it's a more layered verdict than it might initially appear, and because the process of arriving at it says something interesting about what this film is and what it's trying to be. Let me start with what the number is not. 6.8 is not a polite way of saying the film is mediocre. Mediocre films don't provoke the kind of genuine emotional response that San Andreas provoked in me during its best sequences. Mediocre films don't contain performances as specific and committed as Carla Gugino's work throughout, or as quietly devastating as the scene between Ray and Blake that I described in the spoiler section. Mediocre films don't build visual set pieces with a structural coherence and earned escalation that Brad Pitt brings to the best sequences here. Mediocrity is comfortable. It doesn't ask anything of you. San Andreas asks things of you. It asks you to care about these people, to invest in their survival, to feel the specific weight of their grief, and in its best moments it earns that investment completely. What 6.8 is saying is something more precise. It's saying that this is a film that reaches for genuine greatness and arrives at genuine goodness, and that the gap between those two things is visible, specific, and traceable to decisions that could have been made differently. The emotional architecture of San Andreas at its deepest level is the architecture of a film that could have been a 10. The story of a father running from grief disguised as a hero, forced by catastrophe to stop running and face the thing that broke him. That's a story with real depth, real resonance, real humanity. And if it knows it has that story, it just doesn't always trust it enough to let it breathe without surrounding it with more spectacle, more noise, more reassurance that you're watching a proper blockbuster and not just a family drama that happens to have a $300 million wardrobe. That tension between the intimate story the film wants to tell and the spectacular film it feels obligated to be is the source of every shortcoming I described in the previous sections. The underdeveloped antagonist, the pacing drag in the second act, the refusal to engage with civilian suffering, the slightly softened landing. All of these trace back to the same root. A film that was never fully given permission to be as small and as honest as its best instincts wanted it to be. And that's not a failure of talent. It's a failure of nerve at the institutional level that happens to talented people all the time in big budget Hollywood filmmaking. The money demands a certain kind of film, and the certain kind of film doesn't always leave room for the most honest version of the story underneath it. 6.8 then is my way of saying this film is better than you think it is, and it's not quite as good as it should have been. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and holding both of them is how you watch a film with real attention rather than just enthusiasm or dismissal. Now, who should watch San Andreas? Let me be specific, because I think the answer is more nuanced than the film's genre classification might suggest. If you are someone who genuinely loves disaster cinema, who has a specific appreciation for the craft of large scale visual effects work, for the spatial logic of survival sequences, for the way a well constructed set piece can create genuine physical tension, San Andreas is essential viewing. Not because it's the best disaster film ever made, but because it's one of the most technically accomplished and emotionally sincere entries in a genre that is frequently neither of those things. It will give you exactly what you came for, and it will occasionally give you something more than that. If you are someone who connects to family drama, to stories about grief, about the specific emotional damage that loss inflicts on the people who survive it, about the difficulty of rebuilding trust and connection in the aftermath of catastrophe, San Andreas has more for you than you might expect based on its marketing. The emotional story underneath the spectacle is real, and it's handled with more care and more honesty than the trailer suggests. You will need to extend some goodwill to the genre conventions surrounding it. But if you can do that, you will find something genuinely moving inside this film. If you are someone who watches films primarily for narrative rigor, for airtight plotting, psychologically consistent characters, thematic coherence from first frame to last, San Andreas will probably frustrate you. The screenplay has real weaknesses. The logic of certain sequences requires suspension of disbelief that goes beyond the ordinary demands of action cinema. The thematic resolution is incomplete in the ways I described, and the film's relationship to the scale of destruction it depicts will likely strike you as morally unexamined in a way that is difficult to move past. You can still find things to appreciate here, the performances, the direction, the technical craft, but it will be an act of selective appreciation rather than full surrender. And full surrender is what this film really wants from you. If you are someone who has never particularly engaged with disaster cinema, but you are curious, if this is a genre you've kept at arm's length because you assumed it was all noise and no substance, San Andreas is actually a reasonable entry point. It has enough emotional grounding to give you something to hold on to, enough visual ambition to justify the spectacle, and enough genuine craft in its central performances to give you real characters to follow. It's not the most demanding thing you'll ever watch, but it's not the emptiest either. And sometimes a film that sits comfortably in the middle of that spectrum, that gives you genuine entertainment and genuine feeling without demanding everything of you, is exactly what you need. Now, how should you watch it? This is a film that was made for the cinema, and ideally that's where you'd see it first. The scale of the visual effects, the spatial scope of the destruction sequences, the sound design, all of these are significantly diminished on a smaller screen. If you have access to a large television and a decent sound system, that's your next best option. Watch it loud. Let the sound design do what it was designed to do. The low subsonic frequencies that precede the earthquake sequences, the roar of the tsunami, the specific acoustic signature of a city collapsing, these elements are not incidental. They are load-bearing parts of the experience. A film that is partly trying to make you feel as if the ground is moving underneath you should be watched in conditions that give it the best chance of achieving that effect. In terms of owning versus streaming, San Andreas is a streaming film for most people. It's the kind of film you return to occasionally, catch on a Saturday afternoon when you want something genuinely entertaining and emotionally satisfying without having to work too hard for it. It doesn't demand the kind of deep, repeated engagement that would justify physical ownership for the average viewer. But if you are someone who loves disaster cinema specifically, if this is a genre you return to often and study with genuine attention, then owning it gives you the ability to pause on the sequences that deserve close examination, to study the visual effects work frame by frame, to go back to the emotional scenes and notice the layers of performance that a single viewing doesn't fully reveal. For that viewer, ownership is worthwhile. I want to close the box with one final thought, and I want it to land properly, so let me build to it. San Andreas is a film about the end of the world as a metaphor for the end of a family. And what it argues, through everything, through the spectacle and the survival sequences and the quiet moments in wrecked buildings, is that the end of a world is not the same thing as the end of everything. The world that existed before the earthquake, Ray's professional identity as the man who saves everyone, Emma's careful construction of a new life on top of old grief, Blake's independence as a way of not needing either of her parents too much, that world does end. The earthquake destroys it completely, the way the real San Andreas Fault would destroy everything above it if it truly ruptured. And the film doesn't pretend that the world after is the same as the world before. It isn't. It can't be. But the people survive, not unchanged, not unscarred, not carrying less than they were carrying when this all began, but alive and together. And finally, Thamdi, no longer running from the things that broke them. And the film's most honest argument is that surviving together with the truth finally on the table between you is worth more than any version of things being fine. What more than the comfortable management of an unbearable loss? What more than the performance of moving on when you haven't moved anywhere at all? Ray Gaines at the end of San Andreas is not a better rescuer than he was at the beginning. He is the same exceptional professional he always was. What's different is that he has finally stopped using that excellence as a way of avoiding the one rescue he never knew how to perform, the rescue of himself. From the guilt, from the grief, from the story he told himself about Mallory, about failure, about what kind of man he was and wasn't. That rescue doesn't happen in a helicopter. It happens in a broken building with his daughter's hand in his, saying the unsayable thing out loud for the first time. And it is, in the end, the most important rescue in the film. Every film is a box, and we open this one together. Now, before we properly close out, let me tell you exactly what I think you should take away from this one. Not just the plot, not just the rating, not just the analysis, the feeling, because the feeling is what stays. San Andreas will not change your life. It will not reorder your understanding of what cinema can be. It will not haunt you the way the truly great films haunt you, following you into your dreams, resurfacing in your thinking weeks after you watched it, demanding to be reconsidered. It is not that kind of film, and pretending it is would be dishonest in a way that disrespects both the film and you. What San Andreas will do, if you let it, if you watch it with genuine attention rather than half an eye and a phone in your hand, is give you 2 hours of genuine emotional and visual engagement. It will make you feel the specific fear of a parent who cannot reach their child. It will make you feel the specific relief when the reach succeeds. It will give you images of destruction that are genuinely astonishing in their scale and specificity. And underneath all of it, it will give you a quiet, honest story about grief, about what grief does to people who don't know how to carry it, and about what happens when the weight of an unspoken loss finally becomes too heavy to keep running from. That's not nothing. In the landscape of blockbuster cinema, where so many films of this scale are pure delivery mechanisms for sensation with no emotional architecture worth discussing, a film that has genuine feeling underneath its spectacular surface is worth recognizing, worth engaging with seriously, worth opening up the way we've opened this one up today. 6.8, a film I'm glad exists. A film that falls short of the best version of itself in specific, traceable ways. A film with a genuine emotional core that the spectacle sometimes serves and sometimes obscures. A film worth watching, worth discussing, worth taking seriously, especially when it doesn't fully take itself seriously enough. That's San Andreas, that's the box. And now it's open. Every film is a box, and we open this one together. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Genuinely, thank you. These breakdowns take real time and real thought, and the fact that you're here watching this all the way through means everything to this channel. If you got something out of this, if there was a moment in this breakdown where something clicked, where you saw the film differently, where an idea landed in a way you didn't expect, please hit the like button. It takes 1 second and it helps this channel reach more people who love film the way you do. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. The film box is built for exactly the kind of viewer you are. Someone who doesn't just want to know what happens in a film. Someone who wants to understand why it happens, what it means, and what it says about being human. That's what we do here, every single video. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, I want to know what you think. Here is the question I want you to answer in the comments below, and I want you to think about it genuinely before you type. The film argues that Ray's professional excellence was, in part, a way of running from his grief. Do you think the film earns that argument? Do you buy Ray's emotional arc as something that was genuinely resolved by the end? Or does the spectacle get in the way of the resolution and you left the film feeling like the emotional story wasn't finished? I want your honest take. I read every comment on this channel, every single one. And one more thing before I go. The next box we're opening on the film box. It is a film that also deals with catastrophe, with survival, and with the question of what human beings are capable of when everything they knew is gone. But where San Andreas looks outward, at the earth, at the city, at the scale of physical destruction, the next film looks inward, into the mind, into the specific, terrifying landscape of a person trapped inside a situation that seems to have no exit. It is quieter than San Andreas, it is smaller in scale, and it is, in my honest opinion, one of the most psychologically precise films made in the last decade. I think you're going to find it genuinely fascinating. Stay subscribed. That box is coming very soon. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.